Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Again, welcome to the Advisory Council meeting tonight. I'm not sure I saw all the names that have popped up for attendance, so if I'm going to call the names of the people who I see at the moment, and if I'm missing someone at the end, please announce yourself. So I see Doctors Haft and Reedman. I also see Bob Atlas and Debbie Kuchka-Craig. Is there anyone who is participating from the Advisory Council that I haven't announced? Oh, I see Dr. Okiki. Welcome. Anyone else?
Kevin Hayes.
Kevin, good afternoon. Others? Okay. We will keep moving forward with the announcements, and then we'll come back to clarify the attendance. So at this stage, let me invite my colleague, Melanie Cavalier, to make some opening announcements.
Good evening, everyone. We just want to remind you that the meeting is being recorded. We did send around the PowerPoint slides as well as a PDF version. If you would like to follow along, we sent that to the council members directly prior to the meeting. They're also posted online. So I want to make an important announcement. In the event the meeting is hacked, please hang up immediately. And then I will send you an email through the MDPCP mailbox with a new meeting link that will allow you to log back in, and the meeting, the recording will be available to the public. So please contact Anana or Melanie or send a chat message if you're having any technical issues. You can mute and unmute yourself using the small microphone button at the bottom of the screen. So please remain on mute when you're not speaking to reduce the background noise. Staff may mute you if there's a lot of background noise, but you're always able to unmute yourself. So you can use the chat function. It does send notes to all attendees. This technology does not allow you to send a message to a specific attendee. So please announce yourself when speaking if you're on the phone so that we'll know who's making comments. So everyone in this meeting is free to speak throughout the meeting. Since there are a lot of people, we would like to sequence speakers when possible. So if you want to signal to the team by holding something up, then the meeting facilitator will call on you. You can also put in the chat function, and then as we go through the comments, we can read the chat out loud. So that's what I have at this time. I'll turn it back to David.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. Good afternoon. So I see the addition of a couple other Advisory Council participants. I see Jean Ransom has joined, and Doctors Barr, Berenson, and Pham. Welcome, everyone. We are going to continue along the same lines as we did on the meeting from last week. And before we get to that point, I would like to invite Dr. Haft to make some comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. So I wanted to just start by answering a question, a very good question that Dr. Barr raised last week that I didn't, I think, adequately answer. His question was, what do we intend to do with this model? What is the intention overall? And I just wanted to be maybe a little more specific, and maybe it'll help frame the discussion that we're having tonight and other nights. I think our intention for this model is that we will build on and make it better than what we had previously. And in that context, we want to be able to continue to meet the goals of the total cost of care contract, such as or within the MDPCP, which is to broadly transform healthcare delivery across the state, which I think we are doing. We're making good progress in doing that with a very broad implementation of this program and continuing to grow. And that we will meet the population health goals such as they've been defined by the SIHIS and by the state. And in doing so, that we will help to avoid avoidable hospital and ED utilization, help to drive down costs as we do that, and other things that will happen to reduce costs over the long haul. In order to do that, so this is the important part that I weren't talking about last week. In order to do that, we'll need to make sure that the model that we have, the intention for this model, is that it builds on what we have before. Clearly, we're going to want to use the elements of primary care first, that is a population-based payment and a flat fee, together with a performance bonus. And the population-based payment and the flat fee will be themselves subject to an asymmetric risk. So that's something that's a new feature. So we're going to add asymmetric risk to that. But as we do that, the intention is not to diminish the program, but to grow the program in the aspects that were mentioned. That is to continue to be able to do broad transformation across the state, to be able to continue to meet the population health goals of the state, which requires, if we're going to address population health goals, we need to address the entire population to the extent we can. So in doing this, in designing this model, we want to make sure that we can keep what we have and build on that. So as we think about that, the starting point for going from what we have to where we want to go in the future, the starting point in terms of that basic payment can't be disadvantaging the program. It can't be less than what we're already starting with in the program in track 2 of those practices that we're moving on, or they would not be interested in taking that and then taking on risk on top of that. So we have to make it more or less, we have to make it attractive enough even before risk is applied to it, so that it would not discourage practices. We have to do that in the context of knowing that most of the practices in Maryland are small and medium-sized practices. As we said before, 78% of our practices are 5 or less providers. So we can't do a program that would take those practices and disadvantage them and say we're not interested in that. So we need to be sensitive to that, while at the same time understanding we're moving progressively away from minimal risk to putting the majority of the Medicare revenue for practices at some risk. And then we need to think about what that risk would be and how to make it progressive risk over time and those kinds of things. But our starting point needs to be someplace where we're not going to scare practices away, where it is at least as good as a starting point as what we have now, and probably marginally better if we're going to be putting much more of the revenue at risk. So I think that's the intention of what we're going through now, is to keep the design features of performance-based or population-based payments and flat fee and a performance-based adjustment, while making the numbers fit correctly into the context of Maryland. So I think that's really the way we're going. And I think if we can think that way, we'll understand why we're going through these permutations of looking at different ways to revise the primary care first model to make it work in the context of Maryland's unique circumstance.
Okay.
Other than that, I think just, there's going to be, I think tonight, a lot more good discussion about what we've already talked about in terms of these particular elements of looking at it, whether we look at average payments for practices, describing practices by their average HCC scores and paying them accordingly, or the money follows the person, and then trying to understand how best to configure a neutral payment. I think those are great things to address and hopefully finish that discussion tonight.
And Dr. Haff, before we turn this over to Dr. Riedman for any comments, could you save us a step by introducing the presenters? And Alana, if you could just bring up the presentations, Dr. Haff could introduce our guests, and then Dr. Riedman could make some remarks.
Yeah, certainly. I think for those who might not have been here with us last week or in the prior weeks, tonight we're again hosting, or we're welcoming Audrey Spader, who's with H-Metrics, and they've been working on the analytics around the primary care first model, and looking at them in terms of what we can construct in terms of a meaningful translation of that into a track 3 for MDPCP. And Audrey will lead us through, continue to lead us through presentation of the work that they've been doing in conjunction with the PMO.
And thank you, Dr. Haff. And before Dr. Riedman, our executive director has joined us. I don't know if he has comments. No comments. Okay. We'll come back at the end. Dr. Reedman, remarks?
No, I'm actually good. I think in the interest of time, let's move forward. I think Howard laid out the foundation very well. I think there's excellent points, and I'm going to let the conversation go on, and we'll move forward from there. I'm hoping we can get through this presentation entirely tonight, and then we'll be able to go back and to some of the issues we talked about before. And if we do have time tonight, we will go ahead and discuss some of those issues. But I'm going to turn it over to Audrey to go ahead and start her presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Audrey.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're glad to be back and to continue our discussion on our preliminary analytic results of our Track 3 modeling. So on the next slide, we're going to start with a very brief summary of our analytic scope and a brief review of the key findings, just to get everybody back on the same page of where we left off last week. I'll briefly review the two different models that we developed that we modeled for the population-based payments. And then I want to spend most of our time today talking about our flat fee amount construction and the options in the modeling of that, as well as presenting some practice impacts. There was some outstanding questions from last week of how our modeling would impact different practices by characteristic, and we have some of that additional documentation to share with you today. Okay, so to jump right in on the next slide, this is just a reminder of how our payment modeling comes together. So what we will be talking about today is the combination of a population-based payment, which is the per beneficiary per month payment that practices would receive for each attributed beneficiary. In addition to that, there is a flat fee add-on that is a per beneficiary per day payment made for, there's 39 select E&M codes that would be consumed within this flat fee rate. The combination of the PBP payments plus the flat fee payments for these 39 E&M services creates the total primary care payment, the TPCP. So you'll see that acronym used throughout this presentation as well. You'll see in the yellow box that we do have a performance-based adjustment that would impact all practices, either positively or negatively. We are not at the point, excuse me, we are not at the point of modeling or presenting results on the performance-based adjustment. So everything I'll be showing you today is getting us to the point of total primary care payment, from which beyond that, there will be performance-based adjustments that are applied at the practice level. So that's a conversation for another time. And then at the bottom, we have not yet considered the role of the seriously ill population and are looking forward to doing that analysis over the next few weeks. Okay, on the next slide, this is our summary of findings for our two different models. And our models really differ only on the PBP side of things. So it's the population-based payment, and it has two different constructions on how those payments are received by practices. So on the left side, we're looking at our practice group analysis. The practice group analysis aligns very closely with the primary care first methodology. This may not ultimately be viewed as kind of a preferable option or a viable option for the way to structure Track 3, but we think it's really important to start at this point to understand the implications of the primary care first structure on Track 3 practices. And for a reminder for those that might not have been with us last week, we are assuming that all Track 2 practices, current Track 2 practices based on third quarter 2020 attribution, would be involved in Track 3. They would volunteer for Track 3. So the universe for our analysis is 122 practices. So using the practice group analysis, or using the practice group kind of construction, each individual practice is assigned to a single PBP group based on the average HCC score for all of their attributed beneficiaries. So if a practice overall has an average HCC score less than 1.2, that entire practice is considered a Group 1 practice, and that practice would receive $28 per beneficiary per month for every beneficiary attributed to them. Based on the distribution of HCC scores for these practices, all of our 122 practices fall within group 1 or 2. There are no practices that fall into those higher tiers or have a higher average HCC score. Based on the population-based payments, according to PCF, this model would have an overall reduction in payment for track 2 practices of 12.5%. So this effectively means that relative to the current payments that these practices receive under track 2, the current CMF payments, plus the current payments that they receive for their E&M services for the same 39 E&M services that are covered under the flat fee, this policy would overall reduce payment for these practices by 12.5%. The practice-specific impact does vary quite significantly. We'll look at that a little bit later tonight, ranging from 38% reduction to a 6% increase in payment. So it really just depends on the practice's individual distribution of beneficiaries by their current risk tier. The distribution of beneficiaries by risk tier is really what drives that practice-specific impact. So again, this overall model has a reduction of total payment of 12.5%. That is the population-based payment plus the E&M payments that they would receive. So on the right side, so we evaluated this policy, we looked at the overall impact, and we identified an alternative policy that is kind of reminiscent of primary care first. It still uses the group taxonomy, but it applies it at a beneficiary level. So it's a money follows the person approach. And that's what you see on the right side of the screen. So this beneficiary group analysis are where beneficiaries are assigned to an individual group. The practice will then have a combination of different groups for their beneficiaries overall. So for example, within a given practice, there will be attributed beneficiaries that fall in group 1, group 2, group 3, and group 4. And that is based on the HCC score of the individual beneficiaries. So this allows the population-based payment to increase with the complexity or the severity of the individual beneficiary. This policy overall has an increase in total payments. So the population-based payment plus the E&M services, the payments for E&M services, there's an overall increase of about 11.5% relative to the track 2 current payments that these practices would have received if they stayed in track 2. And the provider impact, again, is very broad. Some practices losing 21%, as low as 21% reduction in payment, to those that have increases as high as 38%. Okay, so I think this catches us up with where we were last week. I'd like to then continue to talk about the flat fee construction, because I think we started very briefly on this discussion, but there's
Audrey,
a lot of cool stuff. Yeah.
Audrey, can I pause you? Dr. Berenson has a question for you.
Sure.
Yeah, can you remind me what the assumption was about the fixed fee amount in this modeling?
The fixed fee amount in this assumption is an flat fee amount in which the practices would receive the same payment as they do under current law. So effectively, it's a budget neutral policy in which there would be no change in the E&M payment from the current physician fee schedule approach to the flat fee approach. That's actually the first policy we're going to walk through in just a second.
Okay.
And
Yep.
And pause, Dr. Reedman, just for the record, Advisory Council member Kathy Chapman has joined the group this afternoon. Audrey.
Great. All right, so then let's switch to the next slide. Actually, we can go to slide 6 to introduce the flat fee payment. So as a refresher of how the primary care first policy works, the PCF program developed a flat fee payment rate based on a level 2 E&M service. So there is an assumption in primary care first that there are 39 E&M services that are included in the flat fee. For every claim that includes at least one of those E&M services, the practice will receive a single flat fee payment amount. and Primary Care First pegged that flat fee payment amount to 99212. They actually use a 2018 payment amount, and that's $40.82. We're gonna update that and deviate from that a bit. But for perspective, Primary Care First is anchoring to 99212 with about $40. When we look at the distribution of services of E&M services for all of our Track 3 practices, or our Track 2 practices assumed to be in Track 3, and when we look at the distribution of services for calendar year 2019, we find that more than 70% of services fall within 99213 or 99214. So we have a deviation right off the bat that we're not finding that 99212 is the most frequently billed E&M. We actually find that the volume for 99212 is quite low, with 70% of E&Ms being in 213 or 214. For purpose of perspective, the 39 services that are included in the flat fee only represent about 44% of all the services that the Track 2 practices provide, but it does represent 80% of the total allowed payments. So we are looking at it's still a large subset of codes, it's 44%, but it is the vast majority of payments for these practices. And I think that's an important vantage point when you start considering the impact of payment for this subset. So with these assumptions, we have 3 models that I'm going to walk you through. The first one is looking at all 39 E&M codes, looking at the national payment rate for all of those E&M codes, and identifying a flat fee payment rate that would allow the payment for the E&M services under Track 3 to equal what would have been received for those beneficiaries under the fee schedule under current law. So what I might refer to as budget neutral, it is budget neutral in that the payment they receive for the E&M services under Track 3 will be the same as what they would have received if they remained in Track 2 and did not have a flat fee construction. The second model is kind of a halfway step between including all services and getting to where PCF is, which is we're looking at 99211 through 99215. So looking specifically at that subset of E&M codes, we're developing a flat fee payment rate based on that, knowing that the majority of services are billed as 213s or 214s. And the last model is going consistent with PCF. Let's go back and look exactly at how PCF did it and model that approach, where we'd be using only the Medicare payment for 99212. Okay, so before we get into results, I do want to introduce one other concept, which is on slide 7, and this is the impact of beneficiary cost sharing. So since our meeting last week, we revisited the way that beneficiary cost sharing was handled, and we recognized that the way that we applied it in our previous slides, so based on last week's slides, didn't represent cost sharing the way that it needed to be represented. So we have modified it for this week, and I'll walk you through everything we've done there. But the beneficiary cost sharing is actually a really significant driver of impact for this model because it provides additional payment above and beyond the flat fee. So this is just an excerpt from the payment and attribution methodology for Primary Care First. So the way that the flat fee payment works with beneficiary cost sharing is first the provider. So in this example, this beneficiary visits a practice and has an E&M claim for 99214. The Medicare total allowed amount for that service is $117. Recognize, please, that these are all, I think, 2018 values. This does not reflect 2021 payments, which our model will do. So you'll see some disconnect in a few minutes. So to start, we have a claim for an allowed amount of $117. The beneficiary is responsible for 20% of that total, which would be $23.49 for this example here. From there, the claim is adjusted so that Medicare pays the flat fee amount under PCF, which is $40.82, and that's in step 3. That $40.82 is geographically adjusted keep in mind PCF is based on a national program, so it's adjusted for the geographical factors. And that $40.82 turns into $44.09. So the total payment for the provider on the right-hand side in step 5 is the 20% of the beneficiary, $23.49, plus the flat fee geographically adjusted of $44. So the provider is ultimately receiving $67.58 for this individual claim. I think what's important here to note is that we've been talking about PCF as having a flat fee of $40. And while that is absolutely correct, I think we cannot talk about flat fee without talking about the impact of beneficiary cost sharing, because it does provide a significant increase in the payment for practices. So we have incorporated this methodology in everything we're going to show today, where we're capturing beneficiary cost sharing.
Audrey, pause for a moment, please. We have a question.
Certainly.
Dr. Pham.
I'm sorry, this is for the Maryland team, actually. Can you remind me, is there beneficiary cost sharing now for the care management fees that practices are receiving in Track 2?
Dr. Hath.
There is not.
Okay, thank you. I think we just need to be very aware of that. That tends to not go over super well with beneficiaries.
Good point. Thank you. Audrey, please resume.
So we are also, just to be clear, oh, go ahead, Dr. Hath.
There's no cost sharing on the, so there's no cost sharing on the care management fees. And in this model, we don't anticipate cost sharing on the population-based payments either.
Okay, so to the beneficiary, this would just look very similar to their current copay for
Correct.
any
Correct.
regular E&M visit. Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
Yep, I think that's a very good clarification. Is the beneficiary cost sharing under Track 2 current law and Track 3 is identical. It's still 20% of the services that were actually received on the claim. And yes, there's no beneficiary cost sharing for either the CMF payment or the population-based payment that we're including. Okay, so let's look to the next slide, and let's walk through our first approach to flat fee payment. So again, to repeat, we have 39 E&M services that are included in this flat fee. We have taken the distribution of those services for calendar year 2019 for those Track 2 practices to their attributed beneficiaries and updated the payment rates to reflect 2021 Medicare physician fee schedule rates. So we are looking at intended payments for 2021, assuming the proposed rule goes in as final as written. Based on the distribution of those services, you'll see the 99213 and 214 represent about 70% of all services combined. And the overall weighted average national payment rate for 2021 for these services is about $116. So again, this is allowed payment based on the fee schedule. We also noted when doing this analysis that in 13.5% of claims, these practices are billing more than one of these E&M codes at a time. So for example, they might have an extended E&M visit, or they may have a 99214, but they may also provide advanced care planning, or they may also provide one other E&M service on that claim. To account for the multiple E&M services per patient per day, we have adjusted that $116 value to be a flat fee allowed amount of $132. Effectively, what this $132 represents is that the provider or the practice needs to receive, on average, $132 per patient per day in order for the total payments in this flat fee construction to equal the payments that they would have received under Track 2. I want to pause there and make sure that's clear, that the practice needs to receive on average $132 per patient per day per claim, effectively, in order for the payments under Track 2 to equal the payments under Track 3 for these E&Ms.
Hey, Audrey.
Yes.
Can I I just want to pause there for a second and just make sure that nobody has any questions on that or the previous slides before we move on. I think those are important points. So if there's not any questions, we can move on. I just want to make sure.
Dr. Berenson.
Yeah,
I
could
had
we
a
go
question.
back to the prior slide, please?
Go ahead, Dr. Berenson.
Could we go to the prior slide first?
Sure.
All right, so I want to know something about who's getting billed under this model. The standard is to bill if the patient has a Medigap insurer, to bill the Medigap insurer who then adjudicates the claim and pays their share, and then passes it on. Basically the doctor gets to bill the copayment. Who is submitting the payment on the flat fee? I mean, is CMS paying that directly? And what happens to, I guess my question is, where does the Medigap insurer fit into this? Or if it's Medigap, or if it's Medicaid, or if it's whoever the supplemental is. Are they involved with this claim submission at all?
So it's my understanding that they would handle the beneficiary cost share exactly as they're doing it currently under the fee schedule. So that process doesn't change. The only thing that changes is when after they pay their after that copay section is separated out, there is a claim adjustment that says rather than paying the 80% of the $117, rather Medicare pays this flat fee of $40.82. So I think your question is who the Medigap and Medicaid, how are they involved? I don't think that has changed. I think it remains to be the way that they're involved now under fee schedule.
So the supplemental insurer is going to pay the flat fee?
No.
No, they would pay the patient.
The flat fee is paid by Medicare, and then the supplemental pays the co-insurance portion.
So the physician is generating two bills, one to Medicare and one to get the cost share?
So if a patient has a co-insurance, that's ordinarily what would happen. They bill both the Medicare and the co-insurance.
So they would have to, Audrey, would they have to wait for the adjudication of the modified claim first, and then the Medigap plan would get billed?
Would Medigap have to wait for that?
Yeah, because Medigap wants to pay the copay based off of the modified claim, right? Not of
Medigap. So that's the interesting part of this, is that Medigap pays their copay based on the 99214, not based on the flat fee.
Yeah, because actually the practice is under this model. The practice bill, although they're getting a flat fee in terms of payment, they're billing exactly the same code as if they were doing whatever the level 2, 3, 4.
So they're getting actually a higher copay as a percentage.
Yes.
Than one would expect.
I'm worried about the billing cost to the practice and whether they're submitting an extra claim. You're saying they're not. Don't assume the Medigap plan is always picking up the cost and the co-insurance. It depends on which Medigap you pick. In my case, I have a $20 copayment that I'm paying under my Medigap, and there's claims flying all over the group.
Right, but to you it would look the same, Bob. It's just interesting to me that the beneficiary would be paying off the original intended fee schedule price as opposed to the modified primary care first price.
So Audrey, to clarify that, so if I charge a level 99215 and let's say $150, the Medigap would pay the copay on that number, and I'd still get the $44 or the $40 from the flat fee.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. So what's important, Dr. Pham, you summarized it very well, is that the co-insurance or the cost share, let's just be more broad, the cost share for the beneficiary is identical under current law. So track 2 cost sharing and track 3 cost sharing is identical. The beneficiary will have no changes there. What changes is the Medicare side of it. The Medicare payment changes.
Okay. And Ben has a question.
Yeah, I think that, it's worth noting that the share that's of the fee paid by the patient is going to go up, which will be kind of a shock to patients who think I'm paying 20%, Medicare's paying 80%, and it will not be that. I think if we followed the primary care first rules, it is also possible that practices could waive the copay, given that probably 35% or have Medicare sup of some sort. Noted Bob's observation that it depends on what plan you have is noted, and what another 30% in Maryland have Medicaid. I kind of think it's unlikely that physicians are going to waive copays on the Maryland beneficiaries, but it is possible. But the shock will be for patients who say, I thought I paid 20%. In some instances, it could be closer to 35 or 40%.
It could be equal. It could be equal to, in some cases, equal to or more than if there's multiple E&M services on a claim. Definitely.
But I just want to clarify, who generates the EOB that the patient gets? Is it still the supplemental, or is Medicare directly paying? I mean, is this being administered out of Medicare central office or regional office, or somehow are the supplemental carriers still administering and doing the claims adjudication?
We don't know that yet, I don't think.
Okay.
Okay.
You know how it works now under CPC Plus? All right, it's just a placeholder then for some discussion.
So Bob had a question.
Under CPC Plus, there's no change. It's just as fee-for-service Medicare. I don't know that, we haven't heard what Primary Care First is going to do in terms of whether they'll change that for this portion of the payments, the flat fees, whether they'll move it to a different.
So, but when you say there's no change, you're saying that under Track 2 of CPC Plus, if there's a supplemental insurer, they are administering a different fee schedule. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's how it's happening. It's not a separate contractor or a central office. All right.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, we're way down a rabbit hole here. I mean, I think there's plenty of administrative questions to ask, but I'll just add to it, which is we're assuming that the person has met their deductible. So the question really, I would add, to complicate it, is what if the person has not met their deductible? Are they going to have to pay the Medicare fee schedule amount or the flat fee amount? And I'm assuming they're going to have to pay the Medicare fee schedule amount in full, and that's going to go against their deductible accumulation, correct?
That seems correct.
That's actually a really good segue to the next slide. David, were there any other questions you wanted to go through, or should we continue?
Just want to confirm, I thought I saw Gene Ransom had a question at one point. Gene, if that's correct, please ask the question. Okay, that may not be the case. Okay. One moment, please, Melanie.
So would it be helpful if I circulated that the payment methodology document from CMS to everyone, David? Not right now, but after the meeting.
Let's have that conversation offline with Dr.
Okay.
Ben and Howard.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we can move on to your presentation then, Audrey.
Great. So let's look at slide 8 then, back to slide 8. So I got us through the point of saying that a flat fee allowed amount, so the amount that the practice needs to receive overall needs to be $132, so that the total payment for E&M services under Track 3 is consistent with the total E&M payment they would have received under Track 2. But the beneficiary cost sharing is really critical in this equation. And Bob, I appreciate you mentioning the beneficiary deductible, because that's something that we factored in as well in aggregate. So we've looked into the allowed amount for 2019 and the amount that Medicare actually paid for those E&M services, and found that beneficiaries were responsible for 27% of the overall Medicare allowed amount for these E&M services. So we're used to hearing about an 80-20 split. Medicare pays 80%, beneficiaries pay 20%. In reality, for these practices and these attributed beneficiaries, for these E&M services, the beneficiaries have been paying 27%, and Medicare has been paying the residual of 73%. So what you're going to hear me talk about is a 27-73 split. So that's that. That factors in that's copay as well as the deductible payments. So let's go back to our $132. If we're saying that $132 is the total payment that the practices need to receive, once we factor in the beneficiary cost sharing and we reduce out that 27%, the flat fee payment amount using this approach would be $96. So $96 plus $36 of beneficiary cost sharing equals the $132 that are required for this overall system to be neutral, to be in sync with current payments in Track 2. Any questions on this? I think last time we introduced it as a flat fee of $132. And just to be clear, the flat fee component is $96. The beneficiary cost sharing is $36 for a total of $132 to the providers. Okay, so let's look to slide 9. I'll just keep going, but please interrupt if at any point if we get stuck. This is how it would play out at the practice group level. So you'll see that the total E&M payments is $40.8 million based on 2019 utilization, inflated to 2021 payment rates. Under both the current E&M allowed amount and under the flat fee structure, those payments are virtually identical. So by having total provider payments equal $132 per claim, a $96 flat fee, there is no impact, no overall impact, no increase or decrease in the total payment received for flat fees in aggregate. Of course, provider impact will vary significantly, just as a function of what codes those individual practices are actually billing.
Audrey?
You go. Yes.
You've been very careful to apply your benchmark terminology, right? Projected to, based on, but I think when we are outward facing to practices and stakeholders, we're going to need to add probably an extra layer of clarification,
okay,
because there is COVID and there will still be COVID in 2021. And I'm not sure that projecting revenues for them based on 2019 utilization will give them a realistic picture. So I just to parking lot that, when we actually begin external facing, we're going to need to be careful about the language, I think.
Perfect. Thank you for that reminder. I think that we were very intentional in using 2019 for that reason, because we hold no reliability to 2020 right now, but that is certainly something we need to consider.
And I would add that even the 27% is the beneficiary's obligations. That doesn't mean it's all collected.
Right.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Good point.
That's correct.
So in outward facing, that has to be pointed out also. That's their obligation.
Great. Okay. On the next slide, we are just showing the beneficiary group model. And again, the results are the same. We are holding our E&M payments received for practices for E&M services is the same under Track 3 flat fee as they would have received under Track 2. There's no impact overall. There's slight variation in the individual groups, and that just depends on the mix of E&M services that are provided to those beneficiaries. But overall, we're holding the total dollars in the system, or the total payments to practices, consistent. So this is the model that is incorporated into all of the impact analyses that you've seen so far. So that summary analysis that we showed that I started the presentation with, that is assuming that the E&M payments for the flat fee construction are consistent with the E&M payments under current track 2. So that impact is not driven by any change in E&M payment. But we wanted to provide two different alternatives of alternative ways to handle a flat fee. So on the next slide, we're looking at a subset of codes. We're looking at E&M code 99211 and through 99215. The intent of this model is that we recognize that PCF uses 99212 as the anchor code, but based on the distribution of services, we felt that looking at this subset, the 211 to 215, would be more realistic given the practice pattern or the billing patterns of the practices. So we're looking at this model, but we have a different intent in mind. In the previous model, we were trying to determine what the payment needed to be to keep E&M payments the same as what they previously were for track 2. That's not our goal anymore. Our goal is simply saying if we were to establish a flat fee payment rate using a similar approach to what PCF used, but rather than using 99212, which we find very infrequently billed, and rather looked at the combination of all of these codes, what would that flat fee payment need to be? So the combination of these five codes, the weighted average national Medicare fee schedule is $110. Once we account for the multiple E&M services provided per patient per day, the flat fee payment would be $125. However, this does not factor in beneficiary cost sharing at this point. So what we've done before is we learned on the previous model that the beneficiary cost sharing is on average $36 per beneficiary per claim. If we take that $36 and add it to the $125, if the flat fee were to be $125, the total cost or the total payment for the practice would receive $161. That is a 22% increase relative to the payment that they would have received under track 2. Any questions on that math before I make it a little harder? Okay, so we're saying in this model that a flat fee payment rate would be $125. The beneficiary would still be responsible for 27% of their E&M services, which is equal to 36, for a total payment to the practice of $161. Now, what's interesting here is that this is now a mechanism that can be used to potentially offset reductions in payments under PBP. So we showed you under the practice group model that the overall model had a reduced payment of negative 12.5%. If it were to be the decision of everybody to move forward with a policy that was practice group oriented, where the PBP payment would be a reduction in payment relative to track 2 payments, and there were to be an E&M fixed flat fee amount that were to increase the payment in this construction, we could actually make that model budget neutral. So to say that a little more clearly, it's one potential lever that could be used to offset potential losses in PBP by having higher payments in E&M.
Audrey, we have a question. Dr. Fong?
Sorry, it's not a question. And so, Howard, if you don't want to start any discussion now, just give me a signal. But just to flag, it seems a little bit perverse to be designing a value-based payment program where, because we, for whatever reason, if we have reticence about making the PBP rationally priced, we would instead be putting the compensatory incentive into a fee for service payment component. That seems rather backwards And I would rather urge us to spend the political capital to rationalize the pricing of the PBP.
Dr.
Just
Hath?
putting that out there for discussion.
No, I think that is exactly why we presented this in this way. I think it allows us to look at those two features. Are we driving toward more fee-for-service, or are we driving away from fee-for-service to population-based payments? This would drive us to incentivize more fee-for-service. So I think it's a great point to raise, and one I think we can consider here shortly.
Dr. Okiki, did you have a comment, question? And you may be muted. Okay, so we're not seeing you well. This is the camera location, and we're not hearing you. We'll work. We have a team behind the scenes. Anani, if you can reach out to Dr. Okiki to see if we can resolve our technical challenge, that would be great, and we can come back to you, Dr. Okiki. Other comments or questions at the moment? Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I think we applied the rules religiously, but what the perverse outcome is that the adjusted total flat fee payment actually is higher than any of the E&Ms except for 99215 in this model, which is probably a non-starter for it as a viable alternative.
Point. Audrey?
Okay. Let's look at the last model. So the last model is staying complete in lockstep with PCF. So what we did is we went back and looked at 99212. It's a low build code in terms of frequency, but we took the PCF methodology and updated it to be 2021 rates. So whereas PCF found that the 99212 payment should be $40.82 based on 2018 payment rates, 2021, that payment rate is expected to be $54.20. From there, we're accounting for multiple E&M services on a claim. The alternative adjusted fee would be $62. Again, adding beneficiary cost sharing, we're keeping that $36 static because that does not change regardless of the flat fee construction. Practices would expect to receive on average $98. This does produce an overall reduction in the E&M services. This would reduce total payments for these E&M services by 25% relative to what they would have received under Track 2 and fee-for-service. Again, this mechanism in combination with the beneficiary group PBP model would actually make that model become virtually budget neutral. It would actually nullify the gains from the PBP payment. If you recall, there was 11.5% increase for that PBP construction. At the beneficiary, money follows the person. This reduction in E&M payment would kind of offset that. I think the overall impact would be 0.4% for the policy in aggregate. Okay, so on the next slide, this is just a brief summary. I think, David, you wanted to open it up for discussion on where the team, I think where everyone wanted to be. This is just a summary of the 3 different constructions and their individual components and what the overall impact would be for E&M services.
And Audrey, can you just summarize again the table you have at the bottom so everyone's together in terms of thinking?
So the first row, so we have 3 different columns, and those are our 3 different constructions. The all E&M codes is using all 39 E&M codes to determine what that what that flat fee rate should be. Second column is only looking at 99211 through 215, that subset of high frequently billed codes, with the third column being the PCF specific methodology for 99212. Looking across the rows, your first row is going to be the flat fee rate that Medicare pays 100% of. The second row is your beneficiary cost share, which stays static across all models because that does not vary depending on what the flat fee is. It's still 27% of the individual E&M codes according to the fee schedule. With the third, the total practice being what the ultimate payment for practices would be. And then again, at the very bottom, just our overall impact. So when we look at all E&M codes, the model was designed so that the total payments for E&M services under track 3 is consistent with what they would have received under track 2. 99215 is an increase in overall E&M payments of 22%. And looking at 99212 alone would have a decrease in total payments for E&M services of 25%.
So, Dr. Riedman, your preference to open up discussion for a policy conversation here or continue onward? And Dr. Riedman, you're muted.
I think we had a consensus last week, and I'd like to just confirm that looking at these models, that the practice group did not seem to be a reasonable alternative. And I think the consensus, and I'd like to confirm that tonight, is that we at least move forward with the expectation that we use the beneficiary group, that the money follows the patient. So I think we had a consensus last week, and I'll open it up to make sure that that's the case now. Jean had a comment there. I just saw it come up.
Melanie?
Did you? I was just going to read. Are you going to read Jean's comment? Or
I can play it if you want. I just didn't know if we were. I would just like to share this with some more of the doctors who are involved in the program, just to get some more feedback, just to see how they feel about it. And I didn't want to do anything as a member of the council that would piss everybody off. So I'm just asking for permission to share the slides with some of the doctors who are in the program outside the group, just to have some more eyes look at it. Is there any objection to that?
Dr. Haft, Ben, my thinking is that they're complex, and having attended several of these discussions, certainly we're dealing with a lot of super smart individuals, but it can be confusing. So, you may get a lot of questions, Gene, and I don't know how
I understand that, but I will say this: I find the physicians are a lot smarter about this, and they also know when to ask their billing experts or other people. So I think just getting some more folks to look at it is not a bad idea. I mean, and frankly, we should be able to answer the questions. If we can't answer the questions, then that's a problem too. So look, if the will of the group is that we're hiding this, I'm cool with that. I'll honor the will of the group. My preference would be that we get a little input before we put a final stamp on it, and just see if we're missing anything, because I'm nervous about it, to be honest with you. I'm just worried. I want to make sure the primary care doctors are made whole. I don't want a situation where we don't pay them enough, or we ask them to take so much risk they aren't willing to participate in something that I think is really changing the way we practice medicine in Maryland and doing something really huge. And it seems like the H-Metrics folks and all have done a really good job with this, but I just would like some more people to look at it and make sure that it is okay, or there's not any other concerns, whether it be just not understanding it concerns, or concerns because the number isn't right, or what happens if your practice mix is unique? Does that mean you're just out? Or I just think it'd be helpful for us to get some more eyes on it. But I'll defer to the will of the group. I'll be a team player.
Yeah, sure.
Gene, I would just comment. I think your point, we certainly want to get stakeholder input. That's the purpose of these meetings, and have been the purpose of these meetings. And as you know, creating a model without stakeholder input is fraught with all sorts of problems, and we don't want to face. I would say though that these are open meetings, and people are free to dial in and listen. They have free to dial in and listen. So we haven't kept anybody away from this. We post these numbers weekly for all the practices. They're all absolutely all free to listen in, and we just got done surveying practices on some of these decisions also, and we'll continue to do that. But I don't know, and the slides I believe are public.
Yes.
So all of that is now available. And to answer your question, we don't want to stifle any communication. If people, we would love to have people be looking at these slides as they're posted and listening into the discussions. So I think that's a good thing for, if you can encourage the providers to do that. That's why we're meeting every week and having these discussions in an open forum.
Yeah, so let me do this then. How about if I write something up that we send out to primary care physicians, pointing them to the information, reminding them of the ability to call in, and I'll show it to you, Howard, before I send it out, okay, to make sure that you feel comfortable it's not going to create confusion. That's not the goal here. I just want some more people looking at this. I think this is very complicated, and my fear is we're going to create something that discourages participation, which I don't think any of us want to do on this call. I think what we want to do is come up with something that really incentivizes taking that next step to real value-based care, and that's what we're trying to do. But we need to make sure that we recognize that the primary care doctor is playing a very vital role, and they should be compensated fairly for doing that. And I think that's my fear, is that we're going to make a mistake, and then we're going to lose a lot of participation.
Yeah. Thank you, Gene.
David, can you hear me now?
Yeah, but I'm going to keep going in sequence. Yes. So it was Ben, Bob, Dr. Pham, and Dr. Okiki. And Ben?
Oh, excuse me. Yeah, I mean, I think Howard said it. The first sentence was, these are open meetings. The only thing I would hesitate about would be, these are very preliminary at this point. And, certainly other people who are not able to attend, judgment is valuable. I think there is a lot of information behind the slide deck that needs to be provided as well. And if you're comfortable providing that, Gene, I think it's helpful. I think you just need to be cautious about that, recognizing that the deck itself doesn't fully tell the story.
Okay, Bob.
Yeah, well, I guess at risk of agreeing with Gene, I agree with Gene in the sense that, first of all, I think the materials are public. I mean, anybody who could be watching this, they could be taking screenshots, what have you. So, we have hospital systems that are obviously operating CTOs. They've got to work with their physicians, whether they are employed or otherwise affiliated. They need to understand this. And I think this gets to Gene's other question about, is this model something that doctors really are going to appreciate enough to participate in affirmatively? At some point we got to pull the plane up from ground level here and look at it a little bit more from 5,000 feet and decide, what is this all about, and what does it mean for the future of the program?
Thank you, Bob. Dr. Pham, Dr. Okiki, then Dr. Barron.
Yeah, so I want to underscore that last point in that I guess I would encourage that our ethos be first, do no harm. This is this is not a throwaway program, and I don't mean to say that any of us are being flip about it, but this is not a situation where the provider has lots else going on and they can take it or leave it, and it will have marginal impact to their practice. Say if you were a proceduralist and this was one of many bundles or what have you. This is really bread and butter for practices that are already living on the edge. And I think it's incumbent upon us to first do no harm. And so from that perspective, yes, absolutely get their input. But I think also we probably are close to having enough information where we can develop a point of view. And these are not segregable decisions. I don't think it's segregable to say, what do we prefer the flat fee look like without deciding what we need the practice group or beneficiary group decision to be. But I think if we can just be clear, we're not going to do harm here, because my concern is if for some reason participation in the program collapses, that is a loss of trust that may take you many years to rebuild with these practices. Whether or not it was done out of misjudgment or conditions on the ground changes in ways that we don't anticipate, or whatever reason, there's some trust issues in play here, as well as just very concrete business realities we need to be respectful of. But I think, I think many of us are in general agreement about that. So I'm not arguing against anybody. I just thought it'd be important to articulate that.
Thank you, Dr. Pham. Dr. Okiki, Dr. Berenson, and Melanie.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, do we know what the transition or conversion, would I say, rate or timeline is from moving from fee-for-service to value-based care? Is there a global target, and then we can hone it down to the different innovation programs going on? And the only reason I asked is to Audrey's point, if the flat fee is a lever you're trying to pull, are we doing so because we can, at least within a certain framework? And if so, then why not? And I'm saying this only because with the TPCP payment, there is that incremental, what I say, assumption of risk for fee-for-service from the 10, 20, and so on %. So just the thought, I'm not sure if that is something that we have an answer to and how that all factors into this.
Dr. Haft, did you have a response?
Sure, to both very good points. First, to Dr. Pham's very good point, as I said in the beginning, at least it's our intention from the state's perspective to not disadvantage any practices. The starting point needs to be at or better, and probably better because there'll be more risk for this program than it would be from where they are in track 2 currently. So it can't be a program, we can't devise a program that will disadvantage and stifle the movement from fee-for-service to population-based payments, or reduce the great base that we've built on that can deliver advanced primary care across the state. So that would be unacceptable to the state, unacceptable to the PMO, and I would hope unacceptable also to CMMI. So to me, that's a given. On the issue of incremental risk, we haven't gotten to that point yet, but we have some preliminary information from, again, polling our practices that indicates that there is a variety of risk tolerances, and we can talk about that at the future meeting, that suggests that if we imposed a flat amount and particularly a high level of risk, downside risk, that we would lose as much as a quarter to a third of the practices right out of the block. So that also will be as I call it, a non-starter. But that's something we'll have to we'll address in a future meeting. But it would also be something that would be unacceptable. I think all of this is also in context of this is still a program that we need to present to CMMI, and it needs to have at least a relationship to the overall modeling that's done by Primary Care First. That was our instruction from our colleagues in CMMI in order to have any model be cleared through their process. So the basic structure we anticipate will need to stay, and that is a population-based payment, a flat fee, and a performance adjustment. What we do within those 3 buckets, I think, is something that we're deliberating now, and we should do it so that, again, we can continue to build on the great work that's already been done in Maryland, not to detract from it.
Dr. Berenson. Thank you, Dr. Haft.
Yeah, at this point, I feel compelled to make the point that these are interesting constructs using existing codes, but that existing codes pick up work and practice expenses. More than half of the evaluation is for practice expenses. We have PDPMs also going out, which, and if you want to assume roughly a 50-50 split between the capitation and the fee schedule, one should discount these rates to probably 25%. I think a more logical way of proceeding would be to come up with a payment amount in which we could find a consensus that most physicians would feel fairly indifferent to whether they provided one more office visit or not, that the payment would roughly approximate the marginal work that they were doing and a little bit of extra practice expense. To me, that's very close to a level 3. But others would have different opinions about that. I think a level 2 is too little. I think once you're getting over $100, you're probably maintaining the fee for service incentive. And so I would like us to see if working around a level 3 or something like that, based on people's opinions, what would that do to the P? I mean, I guess the basic question I have for Audrey, if we recommended a lower number, let's say we picked the 62, which is would the difference between that and budget neutrality go into the PBPM? Would that increase commensurate with the reduction in the fee schedule that we are willing to live with in the flat fee? Or yes?
We could certainly model it that way. So right now, if you're leaning towards the beneficiary approach, the beneficiary group approach, and were to take the 99212 construction of the flat fee, that model would actually become basically budget neutral. So you would have increases on the PBP side, increases of I want to say it was close to, I don't recall off the top of my head, I have to look it up, but it was significant increases. And you would have decreases on the E&M. The overall system would be made whole. It doesn't necessarily mean that individual practices would be made whole, though.
But what are their sort of the guidance? What degrees of freedom do we have to raise or lower the total amount that would go to primary care practices? I don't understand that. I mean, obviously, if they could get a lot more money, then you'd want to do both, have a high fee and have a high fee. But I mean, are we constrained to having to be budget neutral or not?
Dr. Half?
So we're constrained to the extent that that all of the payments that are made to this program are additive to the total cost of care. So we need to be attentive to even while we're making investments in primary care, to the fact that the state overall needs to meet a total cost of care, both an amount to be saved by a date certain, and also a reduction in the per beneficiary per month total cost of care. So that's the restraint that we have. So we can't give away the farm in essence, but we do need to make sure that when we're moving from what we have now, track 2 to track 3, that there is some marginal benefit, because whatever there is, so it can't be just, to my mind anyway, it can't be just neutral. It needs to be more, because we're going to be exposing that whole amount to risk. And if you're taking risk, you should deserve to also have some potential benefit that you're putting at risk. If you're putting what you had before at some risk, there's no reason to, there's not much reason.
No, I agree with that. I agree. So I would say we should use policy criteria and then try to figure out to make fine adjustments. So in other words, if we're trying to achieve total cost of care reductions, then relatively more should go into the PBPM, and yet the flat fee should not be so low that physicians don't want to do it.
Well, and certainly, we can certainly model along that way.
So I have a suggestion that this is obviously complex, and I think that the presentation so far, and I'm sure it will continue to be excellent. I'm not sure we can make a decision on any of these things until we have the full picture. And the next couple of number slides are actually talking about the population-based payments. I think if we get through the whole process and this whole presentation and look at exactly what the overall impact of the two different components of the total payment to the physicians is, will help us make a decision. So I would suggest that we move our conversation along today to try to get to some of this population-based payment slides, and come back to all of this in one big picture, because we're trying to make, I think, as we're having a conversation, make a decision based on components, and I think we need the big picture. In my mind, the programs are to incentivize, or in my words I've used is more fairly compensate primary care physicians for what they do. They've historically been underpaid for what they do. I think that there needs to be some increase to the base for primary care physicians. I understand the desire and need to not incentivize fee for service and change behavior from that standpoint, but I think if we come up with a program that more fairly compensates them, allows the extra compensation for the extra work, and then an incentive to improve care and reduce all the costs that we need to do is really critical. But I think we're trying to make a decision based on a piece of the information right now. So I would suggest that we move forward, finish this presentation, this meeting and next meeting, and then kind of come back and make some decisions about these individual programs and what we want to do. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, Dr. Reedman, yes. There was a question, I believe, from one council member, and Melanie was going to present it. They've been very patient.
Yeah, I was going to read. There was a comment from Kathy Chapman, and she was asking if she could respectfully request that provider neutral language, because there's many NPs and PAs across the state providing primary care to the beneficiaries. So use provider rather than physician, I believe is what she's asking. Kathy, can you hear us on the call?
And she may have dropped off.
Yeah,
but I
may have dropped off. It's in the chat message if anyone. Oh, there she is.
I'm still here, and yes, that's what I was requesting. Just provider neutral language to include everybody providing primary care.
Good point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think in support of Dr. Reedman's suggested approach, why don't we continue to move on?
Perfect. So so we were actually going to next look at practice impacts. If you can, yeah, so on the next slide, there was an outstanding question from last week of looking at the overall practice impact, looking at the overall program impact, how does it impact providers, and how does that, what's the distribution? What is the distribution of impact? Yep. I'm sorry, should we stop for a question there?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry, Audrey. I'm very sorry, but can you remind me, roughly speaking, based on the modeling you've already done, what percentage of total practice revenue would have been from PBP versus from the flat fee?
Yes. So it is roughly 50%. So under the practice group model, it is 54% E&M, the residual population-based payment. For the beneficiary group, it's actually a little bit lower. It is 42% E&M, 58% population-based.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. So I generally say it's roughly 50-50, but on the beneficiary side, the beneficiary group side, it is a 42%. Okay, so looking at these overall impacts, just a reminder, Model A, the practice group model, had an overall impact of negative 12.5%, a 12.5% reduction in total payments to practices. Model B had an overall impact of 11.5% increase, and this was just the distribution by percentile. So the question came up last week of how are practices going to be impacted differently? So on the next slide, actually on the next few slides, we just have some illustrative examples. I think we can breeze through them fairly quickly of just what's going on. So this plot is just charting, each bar represents an individual practice, just to show you the kind of the skewing or the distribution of those impacts. So you have a few providers. For the top panel is the practice group model. Few providers on the very left-hand side that'll actually fare favorably. They'll have positive or increases in their payment, from 6.4% ranging all the way to negative 38 on the far right-hand side of the screen. It's actually interesting and kind of coincidental that for the beneficiary group model, it's basically the inverse. You have a large number of practices with significant gains. You have as high as 38% increase in revenue or in payment. And on going all the way down to negative 20.7.
Audrey, I'm sorry, I'm confused then. Based on your answer to the last question, this would imply that PBPs would account for a greater percentage of their total revenue under the beneficiary group model, not the practice group model, which is the reverse of what you said.
Sorry, this is the total So let me reground us. This is the total of population-based payment plus E&M services. And the E&M services that are used in this model is the first one that holds E&M payments neutral.
Okay.
Hold E&M payments to be the same under track 3 as they would be under track 2.
Okay, but holding the flat fee equal. If more practices do better under the beneficiary group model, one would expect the beneficiary group model PPPs to account for a greater proportion of their total revenues than would the PPPs under the practice group model, which is the reverse of what you had just said. So that's why I'm confused.
I did not mean, I apologize if I said that. So I was giving you the percents of the E&M. So for,
okay. That makes, I'm good now. That makes sense now.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, those are the E&M percents. Sorry if that was not clear. I swapped that on you. Okay, so looking at the next slide is just a distribution where we bin the practices by their by their loss, effectively by their impact. And what's important to note on the practice group model is that 78% of practices would have a reduction in payment of -1% to -20%. Beneficiary group model, 74% of practices would have an increase of 0 to 20%. What's most important here is that these are generally bell curves, right? You have a bell curve distribution, slightly skewed in the beneficiary group model, but wanted to just show this more as an illustrative distribution. On the next slide, we look into practice impacts by practice characteristic. We wanted to make sure that there were no individual practices that were particularly disadvantaged by this policy. We looked at CTO affiliation, we looked at practice size, and we looked at the region of the practice across the state using the MDH regions. And we found that, relatively speaking, there is no individual characteristic that would be disproportionately impacted by the practice group model. You'll see slight variation, of course, in the practices, but there were no major swings, I would say, in either direction. The last one is just the beneficiary group, and the results are very consistent, that there's no significant swing in either way, that no individual practice group would be significantly disadvantaged or advantaged under this policy.
Audrey, could I pause for a moment? We have Melanie, Dr. Pham, Dr. Burns.
So I just have a follow-up comment to Kathy's comment. This was made by Dr. Barr, and he said, I agree with Kathy. Can we use clinicians instead of providers? So that was to come up with a general terminology. So
that works.
Noted. Thank you.
Dr. Pham, Dr. Barrettson.
Sorry, Audrey. No wild swings except the Western region seems to do less well under both methodologies.
That is correct. That is the one. That's kind of the one exception.
Do they tend to be rural? Do I remember that right?
I did not look that up. I would expect so, but I have not.
It is rural.
The region is the 3 counties out in the Panhandle, so very rural.
I'm in Western Maryland. Garrett County has a total of 20,000 people in the entire county. When I moved there 25 years ago, they had a stoplight, very rural. Allegheny County is about 75,000 people dropping every year. I can't speak to Washington or Frederick, but yes, we are quite rural.
Yeah, and we may not want to contort everything for one region, but just noting that they are consistently doing worse under both methodologies.
They also have a very low denominator. Very low data, so just wanted to point that out.
Yep.
Thank you. Dr. Barrington?
No, I was just waving my arms for other reasons. I'll try not to do that.
So just for a moment, Dr. Reedman, just a time check. How would you like to proceed?
Yeah, how many more slides do you have, Audrey?
One. I would say one, and I would say it's something that we can just put up to the slide. I think it's fairly self-explanatory.
Why don't you do that?
Actually, let's skip this one and go to 21. There was an outstanding question last week of what % of CMF payment, what 8% are CMF payments of total Medicare revenue for the practices. CMF payment plus E&M payments, E&M including the 39 included in the flat fee plus all other E&M services and all other non-E&M, basically everything that the practice is billing. The CMF payments are generally 50% of that overall revenue. So just wanted to show that distribution so people had that data point.
Okay.
But that's all I had.
Great. So, I think this, again, just like last week, this was an excellent presentation and an excellent conversation about it. We've got about 4 minutes left, so I'd like to continue this into next week, obviously. I think these are critical meetings. We'll eventually get back to our old table that we use we still have some other issues to settle, but I'd like to get some more input and actually start making some decisions about some of these suggestions at our next meeting. I'd like to actually ask David and Howard and Ben and our committee that we get together and decide on our agenda for next week and see about how we can consolidate the thoughts we had tonight, and really, again, start making some decisions and move on from this topic after next week's meeting and settle some of these issues hopefully next week.
Dr. Reedman, for the record, we are scheduled to meet again on the 10th and not the 3rd. So
it's election day.
Yeah, we'll be making important decisions on next week, but it won't be about this.
Okay, and then we'll have I guess another week or so until we'll see what happens Thanksgiving week. That might be an issue too.
Yeah, and Dr. Reedman, at this moment, there isn't a date scheduled for the week of Thanksgiving. We can come back to that and try. What we're hearing is that it's a challenge for a number of council members because of the holiday, but we can talk about that more offline.
Okay, let's talk about our next meeting schedule and see where we can go. But I'd like to get again our next meeting, whenever that is, that we settle these issues at that meeting. And we'll take the thoughts tonight. If y'all have any other thoughts, certainly you know how to get in contact with us. I'll turn it back to David and Ben and Howard for some final comments tonight.
Very good. So, Melanie, if you could make some operation comments, then I'd like to invite Ben and then Dr. Howe.
Yeah, so there will be a high-level meeting summary and a video posted online. As we mentioned, these materials that were presented during the meeting they've already been posted online. There will not be a meeting next week due to it being election day. We just mentioned that, but there will be one the following Tuesday from 5 to 6:30. So back to you, David. There was a couple other comments in the chat about using clinicians or practitioners versus providers, but we can talk about that.
Very good.
Chad's comment. Chad, did you see Chad's comment?
Yeah, that it was the overall revenue. That was a clarification on the one slide that she was presenting. I was a little didn't want to just throw it in, but yeah.
Yep, for attributed beneficiaries. Yep.
Yeah. So, Ben.
Very briefly, thank you again all for your attention and thoughtful comments this evening. A big call out to the MHCC staff and Chad, who has a lot of knowledge but is reluctant to share any with us. But I know behind the scenes he's an extremely important player. I am disappointed that we won't have an election watch advisory council meeting, but I expect we'll all be paying attention to that. But I do think give some time to some thought on directionally what your thoughts are as we move into an important meeting immediately after the election. I think a couple of the members really framed it pretty well, that should we be awaiting any the directions we go towards the population-based payments, or should we provide some additional stability by elevating the flat fee reimbursement? I think we'll be tinkering with the flat fees, thinking about those. CMS was a little bit oblique in how they derived those. I'm absolutely not sure we understand how they came up with theirs, but certainly they're going to be an important part of the stability component of this model moving forward. So thank you all.
Okay, Dr. Haft, final comments?
Yeah, sure. One final comment is that we do need to continue to move this ball down the field. And unless there's a strong opinion to the contrary, I think I heard clearly tonight that we favor the money follows the person, the beneficiary model, and that it advances population-based payments. We're still uncertain about how to configure the flat fee, but we're continuing to model around that. So that way we can send that message to CMMI and have them at least react to that so we can move this ball further down the field. Any objections from the council members?
Dr. Reedman?
No, I agree with you, Howard. I just, before we finally finished up, I just wanted to thank Audrey, Mike, and their staff. I think they've done an excellent job of the presentations and leading the discussions. I really appreciate their input. I just wanted to leave with that.
I second that. They're extraordinarily patient with us and very very deliberative and accurate in their modeling. So thank you very much for the work you're doing.
Okay.
And thank everybody in this council. This is hard work, and as you all pointed out, it's extremely important, and we need to get this right.
Okay, everyone. Thank you for your time, and stay tuned. We'll be in touch. Have a great rest.
Thank you.
See y'all.
Great. Thank you all.